Hi, it's Mary Rowe from the Canadian Urban Institute. I'm really pleased to be joining IPAC and three esteemed contributors today to talk about the impact of COVID on cities. It's a topic that this group thinks about all the time. And I'm speaking to you from Toronto, which is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Wendat peoples, the Haudenosaunee, and the Chippewa. And it's home to many diverse First Nations. I'm sure my colleagues will acknowledge the ancestry of the lands that they occupy as well. We're trying as well we can to come to terms with the legacy of exclusion that has existed in communities across the country and has in many ways been reinforced by municipal practices. And these folks can speak to that specifically in their own communities, how that's been manifesting. And during COVID, we've been confronted with all that systemic inequality and how it's been manifesting because the epidemic is affecting people of color and vulnerable populations much more severely than others. So these are things we have to reckon with and come to terms with, acknowledge, and then try to move forward in more equitable ways. There's no shortage of topics for us to talk about, and we're appreciative that IPAC's audience is joining us to wrestle with us on what these challenges really are like and how do we actually move forward. The public service couldn't be more important in Canadian communities across this country, whether you work for the federal government, the provincial government, or local or regional governments. You are extraordinarily important to the viability of our communities and how we're going to recover through this. And I know that my colleagues will speak to that when they each respond. So joining us are Sheila Bassi-Kellett, who's the Chief Administrator for the City of Yellowknife in the Northwest Territories. Prior to joining the City of Yellowknife, she was the ADM at Ministry of Community Affairs, Municipal and Community Affairs for the Government of the Northwest Territories, and she ran her own management consultancy for 3 years. Way to go, Sheila. And in 2020, she was recognized by Municipal World as a woman of influence in local government in Canada. She's joined by Sadhu Johnson, who's the city manager for the city of Vancouver, who is sadly transitioning away from that role at the end of this year, but we're not going to let go of him. He's been at the city of Vancouver for a number of years in different capacities, but he's most recently for the last 5 years been the city manager. Prior to that, he was the deputy. And he brings all sorts of experience from the US, because when I first met him, actually, when he was in Chicago as chief environmental officer for Richard Daley during his tenure. So the young Mr. Daley. Sadhu was involved in establishing the Cleveland Green Building Coalition, and he's continued to be active in all sorts of sustainability initiatives across North America. And last but not least is Carol Saab, who is the newly appointed Chief Executive Officer of the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. She joined FCN 10 years ago, serving as Manager of Government and Media Relations and Senior Director of Policy. She's pretty much done everything at FCM, and now she's running the joint. And we're really, really pleased to have the three of you join on this conversation for us to talk about what is the impact on cities. So what I might do, start off with, is just asking us, just give us a little picture about the challenges that the pandemic has posed to your community in the early stages. Why don't we hear that? Because we recognize, I've been saying it was a sprint, now then I thought it was a marathon. I've decided now it's a steeplechase. But let's start with you, Sheila. Can we just tell us what it's been like in Yellowknife and what you've been dealing with through the last several months, and then we'll go to the others as well.
As I look back on what happened starting back in March, it feels like a bad acid flashback to think back to those days when there were so many unknowns that we were tackling. What was the magnitude going to look like? I remember having a rather dreadful conversation with the head of medicine at our hospital here about keeping the ice into our hockey facilities. Should we need to keep anything as a potential morgue going into warmer months? I mean, we did not know what we were facing at the time, and it was daunting. And certainly for someone like myself, who is a consummate planner, to have the rug pulled out from underneath, that planning did not matter. Anything apart from our business continuity planning was not relevant. In the North, we're quite lucky. We've had a really, really exuberant efforts by our Chief Public Health Officer to keep the pandemic at bay. I'm almost a little sheepish in talking about what our numbers look like, because we have had 5 cases in the Northwest Territories. 5 people who traveled from elsewhere came back home, were found to have had the COVID-19, isolated, and they got better. So everyone's been better since the end of April. And yet we remain on high alert because so much of what happens in the Northwest Territories is reliant, of course, on Alberta, BC, many of the other provinces. And so as we have people coming in for different kinds of work, different kinds of opportunities, it's a big impact for us. So when I flash back to those early days and I think about the rug being pulled out from under us, the things that were most helpful at the time was, first of all, stop and breathe. And I can't believe that that's something that we all have to remember, but in these days, we certainly seem to. And then it became really, what is the policy framework that we need to approach as a city going into what it is that we really don't know, except it's going to be an extraordinary experience that's going to have such a massive impact on everything that we do, the way we live. And so certainly that was really helpful to have a policy framework with principles that drove our actions, and that we knew going into that we needed to pivot quickly, but we needed to do so in a way that always kept a fundamental foundation of public safety, staff safety, and the continuity of core programs and services as the underlying foundation of everything that we did. And I think, like all of us, that feels like 20 million months ago when that was first hitting. But some of those core foundational pieces that we sat down and identified are things that are still continuing to guide us to this day.
Sheila, how big is Yellowknife?
Yellowknife is about 22,000 people. It is the capital city of the Northwest Territories. We're the jumping off point for a lot of different work that goes on. We have our economy is based on everything from non-renewable resource development. We've got some fantastic diamond mines, other kinds of mining as well for rare earth minerals is really increasing these days. And we've also been an enormous tourism hub that our tourism numbers have grown exponentially, of course, up until March of 2020. And certainly we've attracted a lot of international visitors who are really keen to see the aurora, the northern lights. It's a big part of our economic base. And of course, that's been decimated. So a lot of factors for us to be taking into account in terms of how we support that work going forward.
Yeah, well, let's talk about that when we get into a conversation about the impact when you have a city that's got a lot of tourism. Are you a regional municipality or not? Or are you a unicity? And what would the regional population, if you're 22,000, what would the region be around you?
Yeah, so we're not a regional municipality, but we are neighbors, friends now with the Yellowknives Dene First Nation. And I should say that I'm here on Chief Dragi's territory, the traditional lands of the Yellowknives Dene. And so we have a very, it's been a long and arduous history between the city and the Yellowknives settlers. As settlers, the city of Yellowknife was founded in the mid-30s because gold was discovered. It was very lucrative for settlers when they came here, but they displaced the Yellowknives who had traditionally been on these lands for many, many thousands of years. And so right adjacent to us, and in fact, embedded in part of Yellowknife, is part of the Yellowknives Dene First Nation. And we've been working exceedingly hard to cultivate a much more productive relationship based on reconciliation as we go forward. We have been working on everything from joint economic development to the settlement of their inherent right and the things that we can do, including changing the boundary of the city of Yellowknife to be able to honor and respect the traditional lands that the Yellowknives hold as being very important for them to have title to as they settle their inherent right and their Indigenous rights agreement. So in terms of the regional area, we've got the Yellowknives beside us. Our entire territory is a vast landmass with a population of about 50,000. So I don't even know if it's worth it to say.
So are you almost half the population of the province, of the territory?
Yeah, we absolutely are.
Okay, got it. Okay, well, let's go from you to Sadhu. Sadhu, talk to us about Vancouver and the Vancouver region and what the particular challenges have been for you and for the city and then for around you through the pandemic. Quite a different experience than what I think Yellowknife has been coping with.
Yeah, thanks. Firstly, I want to acknowledge Vancouver is on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. And we are also on a journey as a city of reconciliation, working to explore what it means to be a city based on colonialism, whose foundations remain built on and written in pretty discriminatory framing. So definitely a journey that we're on. And so Sheila, I'm glad that you kind of recognize that as well, that many of us are on that journey. So for us in Vancouver, it was a little bit of a roller coaster as well, particularly the first few weeks when we were just asking ourselves so many questions about the implications, as Sheila's already indicated. For us, we were trying to figure out what is our role as a city in addressing a pandemic. Ultimately, were we supposed to declare a state of emergency, or was the province doing that? Were we the ones thinking about closing restaurants, or should the province be doing that? And so a lot of our journey those first few hours was really, and first few days was really trying to understand what's our role. The traditional role of the municipality doesn't include those things, but we were find ourselves in a situation where we needed to ask those questions. And so it was definitely some soul searching and trying to figure out on the go how we could help to address this very quickly evolving crisis. Concurrently, we were needing to transform how we do our work. We haven't talked a lot about it as municipalities, but just keeping the trash picked up, keeping the recycling picked up, the compost, water, garbage, permits, there's a lot that we do that our residents rely on. And so we really needed to make sure that we had all of the systems in place to continue to provide the critical core functions, be it policing or fire services or the other things that I've talked about. So ensuring that we could transform our business while we were providing the service. And so that was a major part of our initial time, striking up the EOS, our Emergency Operations Center, and working to address the pandemic. Meanwhile, figuring out, okay, how do we do our business with 7,000 people that are no longer going to be working in an office or that need to be in a truck together and can't be physically distanced? And so just figuring out how to continue to provide the services that we provide was not an easy task, and getting our staff to review permits building permits, for instance, from home. And normally there's a long line out the door of people standing with their blueprints, and figuring out how to transform that business while we were continuing to provide the services was no easy task, and a very important one. We were concurrently seeing our revenues just go down like this, and we were projecting in March a shortfall of about $180 million in revenues, and so we knew we couldn't just continue to go business as usual. So we were renegotiating our labor agreements and coming up with new framework for how to engage with our employees, the ones that wouldn't have work during this period of time. So that was a big part of it, is addressing the revenue losses. And then we were also very, very concerned about our vulnerable populations, and trying to look at ways that we could support them. We've got a lot of folks that are challenged with homelessness, drug addiction, poverty, mental health, and we were really concerned about the ways that COVID might impact them. If you don't have a place to physically isolate, and you rely on community centers for your restroom facilities or for your food, and all of those places were closing. So we were figuring out how to get thousands of meals delivered to people's SRO rooms on a daily basis, and convert to takeout meals instead of eat-in, figuring out toilet facilities. And so it was just adding a lot of porta potties around town and basic services like that. And then very quickly realized that our business community was just absolutely reeling. And so figuring out, how do we create safe places for people to queue up outside of business as if they had to wait, or provide other ways for people to get around town because they weren't comfortable on transit. And so really putting our minds to how do we support the business community to get through this, whether it's, we did, I think, 400 short-term patios for the summer, and redoing how we go through that process. And so a lot of work around helping the business community to get through this. So it was a pretty major task in kind of reinventing how we do what we do as an organization, and at times many times stepping outside of the comfort zone. So a lot of very steep learning curves, and ultimately feel really proud of the work that our city has done, our staff have done, and recognize that folks have been working around the clock. And ultimately we got very considerable morale problems and challenges with our own staff, who are all working from home and don't have the same structures that they had before to work together as a group.
Do you offhand know the number of cases that you've had in Vancouver?
Currently, I don't know. I know we're dealing with a second wave right now, but I don't know off the top of my head how many we have.
Do you know whether the concentration of cases in British Columbia is concentrated in Vancouver?
It hasn't been. It's kind of scattered. The Lower Mainland has definitely been a part, like a major area, and the concentrations have largely been in care homes, and as we've seen in other places, but it's kind of been throughout the Lower Mainland. We've got about 650,000 people in the city of Vancouver, and about over 2 million in the region. So we are one of many municipalities in the region. And And actually that coordination, I mean, it's great that Carol's on and we'll talk next, but the coordination with other municipalities and learning from each other and sharing, and particularly in a region like ours, where you cross the street and you're in another city and you don't even know it, but there an ice rink is closed versus one is open here, or a playground. And so the coordination within the Lower Mainland has been absolutely critical. And then also the coordination across the country to learn from each other and share experience has been really, really important.
Yeah, it's like we've had to be on our best behavior because we needed to survive. And I don't know when we're going to start to revert to our lesser angels and get back to sniping at each other. But as you say, some of that's been a sort of a perverse benefit of the whole thing. It's interesting, your comment about this. It's a very interesting process that you're reliving there when you say we didn't actually know whose call it was to close a restaurant or whose call it was. And I remember in that early weekend, that mid-March weekend, at CUI, we decided that we were going to create City Watch and City Share and create those platforms because we had a sense that no one actually knew what anybody else was doing. And it was interesting in my team, I've had two experiences where I was living in, you guys all know this, you wouldn't though, Sheila, but where I was living in communities that had some devastating impact. So I was in New Orleans after Katrina, and I was in New York City during Sandy. And there's always this assumption that people make, which happened in March with my colleagues, where they said, no, government will handle that. They'll get the information out. And I just gut instinct knew that you're all just full on, just trying to cope. There's no time to do that. So I think civil society had to rally and create other kinds of tools to help us. So City Watch and City Share became ways for people to quickly go and say, well, what is Yellowknife doing? What is Kamloops doing? And for us, I mean, it's one of those things where we've just had to all kind of pitch in. We couldn't wait. And I really feel municipal governments have had to consistently, nobody on the front lines was spending much time saying, I'm not going to save that person. You've just had to figure it out. But at the same time, for us also to realize that it's not actually that easy getting porta potties into parks. I've talked to a number of people who just were seized with how could they create livable situations for people that had nowhere to shelter to. Who knew, right? And so much of what municipal staff do is sort of thankless, invisible. But when you list off all those things, Sadhu, that you have to keep doing, you have to keep collecting the garbage, you have to, and of course the ones that are obvious, you have to keep running your transit systems. And if you don't do those things, then the community grinds to a halt. And then we have all sorts of public health challenges. So yeah, I hope we haven't given you all PTSD, having to sort of recite all the kinds of decisions you had to make in those early days. But
yeah, it was interesting to relive it. And we were figuring out whether we needed to declare a state of emergency. And right. We ended up doing it and before the province did, but then you ended up having 23 municipalities with different states of emergency, right, requiring different things. And I was like, this is really not going to work. So yeah, that kind of scattershot approach at the beginning was pretty chaotic. We were all figuring it out as we went, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's a terrible way to be prepared for emergencies. We've all had to. But Carol, you're the one with the biggest picture here. You have a purview of all the municipalities, of which there are thousands, hundreds. And I'm wondering if you want to give us a perspective. Maybe I think it would be interesting for people to not just hear about other cities, but also just FCM itself, how you as a national civil society organization with staff and offices and people and all that kind of stuff, and you steward a large organization and you're engaged with other levels of government all the time. So maybe talk to us about FCM's particular sets of challenges, and then if you could just segue from that into some comments on generally what's happening in municipalities, that'd be great.
Sure, happy to do that. Thank you. And I'll also start by acknowledging that I'm coming to this conversation from Ottawa, and so I'm on the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. I'm happy to be on a panel where you're getting perspectives from Vancouver as well as from a community in the north, and it's going to show, I think, what we are experiencing, and even having been at FCM for 10 years, have experienced in an unreal way in the past 7 months, which is how unique the needs are across communities in this country, and it comes to a head in a moment of crisis. And I think what you're hearing is a very real timeline of how priorities had to shift at a rapid pace without an ability to really think through and connect in the outset on best practices, without an ability to really know who was doing what. And For us, and I'll start where you asked me to on the FCM piece, that meant for us pretty quickly realizing that we just had to stop everything else that we were doing that we could and retool ourselves to really focus in on first, how do we help this first wave of emergency crisis response? You know, our members are on the ground and on the front lines, trying to find PPE, trying to do the kinds of things that you've heard the other panelists describe, turn arenas into shelters, doing all of these things. How can we most be helpful? And the two of the main ways we did that was, one, by doing the kind of thing that you're describing, and we were grateful to civil society as well for picking up the mantle and joining in the challenge. But let's get our cities and communities together where there are comparable experiences as best we can, connecting with one another. Let's help them connect the dots so that we can in real time facilitate faster information sharing. And then let's do what is our raison d'etre originally as an organization, and connect the dot between the federal government at the very least, as this is happening across the conversation. I can give you one example off the top, which is, you know, the very real need for PPE very quickly across the country was there. And in our conversations with the Deputy Prime Minister's office, who was coordinating around this, one of her first requests was, can you help us really understand what's needed on the ground, like by community? How can we do this? We know there are shortages. And so we at the outset, you know, very quickly turned, okay, this is job one today. We're gonna canvass our members. We're gonna make sure that we're connecting these dots with the federal government. That evolved into the work that you heard Sadhu and Sheila describe in terms of the arenas into shelters. How do we help vulnerable residents best? How do we do this? And then from there, involved into the sort of next phase of it, which is, you know, acknowledging the realities of Canadians. Municipalities were deferring property taxes. Municipalities were also, you know, we have a need to create social distance, physical space for social distancing. How do we convert our roads in a way to do that well? And all of this required really a sharing of knowledge, a building of knowledge, a sort of capacity building as quickly as we could make that happen. And so as an organization, you know, we are there to serve our members first and foremost. And so everything else that could stop had to stop. And we had to really retool and turn all of our attention to how can we provide these resources? How can we connect our members? It looked like weekly touch points for our rural members, for the big cities, for the mid-sized cities, for the northern communities. How do we do this in a sustained way? And then how do we resource those conversations? How are we giving them tools? How are we developing new tools to share best practices in a real way? And all of the while, how are we connecting with the federal government to inform the pandemic response from a very critical local government perspective? And so, you know, and that at the same time, our organization transitioned basically overnight to remote work. And that's, you know, including our programs teams, that's over 250 people who, you know, are also parents, are also folks caring for elderly family members, are also folks who are dealing with isolation concerns. And so the same kind of constraints that all of us are facing and that Sadhu described in terms of, you know, morale and helping people shift to that kind of a work environment were also true for us as an employer. And so, you know, I've heard people say, you know, as a new CEO, I've been given advice often that, you know, oh, it's tricky to sort of help build the plane and work on the plane as you're flying the plane. And I think what we've learned in this pandemic is that we all had to rebuild our planes while we flew them. And that, I mean, really, it's not hyperbolic to say that lives were depending on our ability to do that and push past, you know, what have been obstacles previously. And so it's been a pretty big pivot. And it's been hard for everybody and for our members across the country, but it's also been, honestly, and I say this quite sincerely, one of the most inspiring things to see and be a part of, because of the way that local leaders have rallied, because of their predominant focus on keeping their communities running, on keeping people safe, on pushing through whatever obstacle needed to be pushed through to make sure that they were doing that for their residents. And so it's a pretty, one day, well, at the other side of this, whenever that may be, we're going to have to really unpack that and ensure that the learnings are real and sustained and not sort of flash in the pan moment of crisis learnings.
Well, let's talk about that because, you know, I'm a big advocate for community-based resilience, that things have to start at the community level. And when you have a crisis like this, it really exposes how what happens on the ground is actually what matters, that's where innovation happens. That's where responsiveness happens. Maybe in normal times, the narrative can kind of not put the same level of profile on that. We just sort of assume that local things take care. Most people have no idea which level of government provides which service. They just know their life works and they know what things irritate them, but they don't really know who's providing it. But when you get into these extraordinary circumstances and people suddenly realize, holy shit, look at all the things that that local government delivers to me. And now here you are in a situation where you've had to go above and beyond. You've had to improvise like crazy. Your workers have been at risk. You've had to deal with all the mechanics of actually delivering service in new ways. And at the same time, your revenue sources have dried up. So can we talk about that? Can we talk about the financial reality? Maybe we'll start with you, if you don't mind, Sheila. What's the situation in Yellowknife financially? What's happened to your budget?
We were exceedingly fortunate as a municipality that we fell into the COVID reality in a reasonably good cash position as the municipality. We have, however, I mean, as everyone has, our fees and charges have been absolutely slammed, and that's been a huge hit for us. If we're relying on property taxes, fees and charges, and government grants, boom, a third has been gone. Property taxes, we haven't felt the hit yet. We're anticipating that coming. But what we've done is we've ultimately seen a significant, and we quantified what the fiscal hit was. Back in those innocent halcyon days when it first hit, we thought, gee, will things be better by July 1st, September 1st, or January 1st? And we use that as our planning windows, which my chief financial officer and I look back on now fondly, and we laugh how naive we were. And so clearly what we've done is we have maintained an incredibly frugal perspective on this. We've done a couple of things, though, very deliberately around this as well, so that we have very deliberately continued with every bit of procurement that we had on the go, whether or not that was infrastructure, whether or not it was studies, RFPs, anything we had going on, where we knew there has been a significant likelihood that we would see a local proponent be successful. We wanted to make sure that the engine of
money. You're still spending money.
Absolutely, because
you don't have any. You're still spending it.
Yeah, and in the times of panic and an emergency like this, government can be a driver of the economy.
Right.
Typically, we love to think that's not the case, but in a case like this where everything else was in a state of paralysis, we had a responsibility to make sure that we continued on with that. And it does give a degree of normalcy as well. I mean, I'm sure I had a lot of my staff and that are responsible for these infrastructure projects and our procurement team as well. We're like, oh my, like they were like, seriously, we're doing this? And yes, we're doing this. Let's keep it going. That was very important to us. And at the same time, we were managing on the backside of that because we have been hemorrhaging money. When we closed our facilities, when we did not have money coming in, we knew that that was such a hard hit for us. So all our rentals, our programs, all of that stuff, the licensing, transit, all of those revenues went down. Some expenditures went down, of course, because we had, our operating costs, our maintenance costs went down. We laid off some of our part-time staff. But our expenditures then for overtime, for PPE, for setting our staff up to work remotely from home, for all of the physical distancing requirements, and we couldn't quantify what that was going to look like. But at the end of the day, we knew it was hitting us. And again, municipalities not being able to deficit budget, huge, huge pressure point for us. And certainly in those early days, there was not a lot of discussion around what kind of support could come to municipalities. And we've been really appreciative that the federal government gets that, roll out the gas tax funding sooner. We love that model. We want to see more of that happen. But we also know that the reality for us is that the financial hit is something that we're going to have to stomach. And so right now, as we're going into budget 2021 and finalizing that, it's been an incredibly challenging process to go through, to try to anticipate with the crystal ball that none of us have anymore because we can't make assumptions about what the future looks like, to base that. And so we've had to be very prudent, very small c conservative in our outlook on this. No new positions. We're doing a stay the course approach going forward when it comes to our infrastructure development, with the exception of two massive projects that we have on the go that we've been talking about for a long time, because we do have a lot of background research that we've done, and some of the indications that we've seen are that these are important projects to continue with. And frankly, a time when perhaps other projects in the private sector are stopping, this can be advantageous to municipalities to continue with some of these larger projects. So we're trying really hard to make sure that we are pushing forward with some of these, which we know can feel like a little bit of a frightening and a daunting thing to do right now. We feel like we're on a bit of a precipice, but very important to continue for the long-term viability and sustainability of the community. It's tough, right? No choice has ever been easy around the money part. So, we had those discussions early on, as I'm sure most municipalities did, like, oh, should we could lay off a cashier at the pool or one of our planners because things have slowed down. Well, we could do that. It's going to save us some money in the future, perhaps, but it's less productivity. We're paying out severance right now. You also develop a reputation as an employer that does not stand by the public service. And so when Sadhu and Carol talk about the implications around morale, that's been a really big part of this for us, is that we want to make sure that we have meaningful work for people. We've definitely redeployed people. Surprise, if your facility is closed down and people spend a lot of time taking apart every bit of those facilities, cleaning them up, doing a lot of the maintenance that never got done when they were full, we wanted to make sure once that work was done, we had other things that we could redeploy people towards. So very important to make sure that we're getting the best bang for the buck, that we have those limited dollars that we have.
Have you had to put anybody on furlough?
Just our casual part-time staff. When we closed down the pool, those high school lifeguards, it sucked. It wasn't nice to do, but okay, those people, the part-time casual staff, they all went.
It's quite an experience. I mean, I'm going to suggest Carol and Sadhu unmute themselves, and Sheila, keep yourself unmuted so that you guys can jump in on each other's conversations and I don't have to call on you each time. But it must be a strange thing for you, Sheila, because you have 5 cases. So there you are sort of in anticipation. I mean, I feel like we're all responding to this public health anxiety that we don't want our system to be overwhelmed, and we're trying to minimize. But it's not as if you're being faced with large casualties. And I think it's just an interesting exercise. Carol, I wonder, when your kids are grown, are you going to look back on this time and say, they learned an extraordinary lesson about prevention or taking necessary precautions to not have something cataclysmic? Not that the deaths we've had aren't a horrible tragedy, but you've got a community with only 5 deaths or 5 cases and everybody recovered, right? So just back to the money piece. Sadhu, you're in a slightly different situation. You have a transit system, although I appreciate you don't run it, but you have other services because you're a larger city. And then I'm going to ask Carol to speak about what the real nut is about when she takes the total amount. She's got the heavy burden on her shoulders. But Sadhu, talk to us about Vancouver's experience financially.
Well, I think Vancouver, like many cities, COVID is kind of unearthed or exposed or exacerbated many of the vulnerabilities that we were dealing with as a community, and it's really shone a light on many of the challenges that we have as a community. So we've been recently doing a lot of work during COVID around racism and anti-Asian racism, anti-Black racism that's really kind of been exposed during this period. The opioid crisis has been just absolutely, really pushed to the limits here, because many of the places where people were going, safe injection sites closed and other things like that. And so the housing crisis, homelessness.
Yeah, just a cataclysm. It's a multiple crises at your feet, at the city's.
And the funding situation is exactly like that. For decades, cities have not had the financial wherewithal to take on the challenges that we are dealing with, whether it's climate change, whether it's homelessness, housing, and so many things that cities, in order to ensure we have a vibrant community, we take on these additional things, and we haven't. And a vibrant economy. And so we take on all these things without having the financial wherewithal to do that. And so we kind of, the property tax bears a lot of that pressure. And then for us in Vancouver, parking fees and other things make up about 25% of that. Permit revenue, permit fees and stuff like that. And so when those take such a hit, it like so many of these other areas, opioids, homelessness, it exposes the challenges here. And I worked in Chicago, as you said before. We had a number of tools that we could go to in our toolbox to help fund the things that we needed done as a city. Tax increment financing or sales tax. And so property tax was one of the things that you would look at when you were looking at all the ways to address the challenges you were facing. And Canadian cities generally don't, for the most part, have that variety of tools. We have some fees, but then we have property tax. And so the financial challenges that we've faced here have really put a strain on us in terms of, can we get the libraries going again? Can we get the community centers going again? Can we start serving meals again? Bringing people indoors and community centers and many of those other types of services that we had to close down. And we had over 2,000 people laid off during the height of the pandemic, right? And so when we bring them in was really hinged on when we could afford to and when it was safe to. So those two factors. And so I'm really extremely grateful for the work that FCM did, working with the federal government to release dollars to the provinces to help municipalities. As we started opening things without knowing whether we were going to have the dollars to do it, just because the community really needed library services. They really needed community centers. Unfortunately, we've had an election called in BC, and so those dollars haven't been released to us yet. But the work that FCM did, releasing them and working with the federal government, I think was absolutely critical, because we know that they're there, and we know that they're going to at some point come and help to fill the gaps that we're facing as a city. So I guess I'd just say, like, we as a country, we're one of the most urbanized countries in the world, yet our municipalities are some of the most hampered in the world. We don't have the tools that I think we need if we're really going to be competitive in the next generation. We're going to continue to grow the way that we need to grow. And so I think that, that's all of us, we need to be thinking really proactively about how do we ensure that our cities are equipped to take this challenge on and grow from it, be stronger coming out of this thing. And I think one of the challenges that we have is we just don't have the financial tools to address the challenges that we are taking on.
So I know that, Carol, I'm going to come to you next, but I also know that in our audience today are lots of people that work for provincial and federal governments. And I know that you've been raised with the understanding that cities and municipalities are creatures of the province, and that the money is collected federally and provincially, and then it is granted back into municipal hands. And I think the point that these folks are making is that the services that residents expect the government to deliver them, a vast majority of those services are actually delivered by local governments. And citizens and residents want to hold accountable government for the services they need. And it's very difficult to do that when the deliverer of the service is dependent on decision-making and priorities being set by other orders of government. And I guess the people are intimidated from having this conversation because they think it somehow becomes a reopening of the Constitution, which Canadians are allergic to. But I think it's really about what good government service looks like. And I challenge IPAC as the network that is connecting capacity of people in public service to come to terms with this with us. That you have to find ways to have money collected and dispensed in accountable ways. And that may mean some changes. Carol, this is your lifeblood. Talk to us about where you're at in your thinking. I know you negotiated to get some relief from the federal government and the provinces this time, but we also know that 2021 is around the corner. So
yeah.
Talk to us.
Well, thank you, and hear on all of those comments from yourself and Sadhu as well on this front. I mean, it really is something. We were talking earlier about how the crisis has exposed a lot of our vulnerabilities as a country and a lot of exacerbated, like, really serious problems we face as a country. Really sort of fabric of our country problems that we need to sort out. And I would say that this is one of them. Not only did people all of a sudden perk up and say, oh, look at all the things local governments have to do in this moment. We need them to keep the services running. What would have happened if we had to go down a road where, because we can't run deficits, municipalities were stopped collecting garbage, stopped doing very fundamental things, cut transit at a time when essential workers and vulnerable populations need to transit the most? What would have happened? We would have like, everything would have come to a halt, including the economy, which is a non-starter. right? And I think it took, honestly, getting to almost a breaking point for our ability to push through that and say there needs to be a solution. And the federal government came forward in a big way with time-limited reprieve, and I think it's important to say it was significant. It gave us really an ability to keep things moving and keep things going. But it is time limited. You're not wrong that municipalities are staring into their 2021 coffers, especially now in many areas on the brink or in a second wave. And the same challenges that were draining the municipal resources very, very quickly in an unprecedented, unimaginable way are looking at us again. And we can continue to relive a cycle. And I think in the immediate, here's where we are, where we say, please help us because we need help. But I think the bigger conversation, the smarter conversation to have as a country is it really tenable that the economic engines of the country, that the governments who are most, defining quality of life for Canadians and their communities can come to a breaking point so quickly? Is that tenable? Right? And we would argue that it isn't. And that if we're really going to be forward thinking, and if we really are going to achieve some of the very important objectives the government is setting right now around climate, around equity, that's going to require the active engagement of local government and knowing that local governments are as resilient as we need them to be to take these massive national challenges on going forward. And, I was struck so many times, and I was grateful to city leaders and to mayors and community leaders across the country who were spending their time advocating alongside us to make this happen. And mostly I felt like, isn't it awful that this is where the mayor's attention needs to be right now? Look at what's happening on the streets of Vancouver, of any city, of any community. And here we are having to spend all this excess time and energy to plead for assistance to just keep fundamental services going on, as if the country has any other choice. And so it really fundamentally felt like, man, if we can't learn from this and acknowledge that the system is fundamentally flawed and that, a fix isn't going to be overnight, but we've got to at least start having a serious, ambitious conversation as a country about what to do, then we're in real trouble. And I think we're seeing some early signs of this. I hope it's not a flicker. I hope we're taking some real things seriously, because one of the learnings I think that I know is real, that I think is being internalized, I should say, is that when we have to move quickly, when things need to be delivered on the ground quickly, and action needs to be mobilized quickly, it's got to be as unencumbered and as direct to local government as possible. And that is not the nature of most of the funding that municipal governments have. And so I think, I hope that this is an experience. A lot of the crises that are still at play as part of the public health response to this, including and most notably homelessness and housing affordability, is going to require direct and more direct than ever, more collaborative than ever relationships with cities across the country if we're really going to move the marker. Otherwise, we may get through it, may get through it this time. The economy will need the local economies to rebound for our national economy to be in any state for a safe restart going forward. But what's going to happen next when the next crisis hits, regardless of what that might be, whether it's health like this or a climate crisis or whatever the case might be, we're going to be reliving and starting from ground zero again. And that honestly is foolish.
It is interesting because if you think this federal government's priority around climate change, for instance, if climate change were to have arrived on our shores in such a dramatic way as the pandemic did, slower burn, that if something so dramatic and so baked into the federal government's priorities, climate change, had knocked on our doors and the local governments were the ones that were going to make or break it. Basically, local governments are the ones that are allowing us to survive this pandemic because you have the capacity to actually deliver services at the local level. If we could make that point to other governments that your priority is only achievable by working collaboratively and putting more resources in our hands locally. Do you ever think that way, Sheila? I mean, you must feel a long way from Ottawa up there.
A long way from Ottawa, but you know what? We're very close when it comes to all of the virtual connections we make. I'm really struck by the comments that Carol makes. And again, something that strikes me, having worked at the provincial territorial level of government for a lot of years, it never ceases to amaze me that we are the most accessible order of government at the municipal level. And so the expectation that comes in terms of what we will do, what we can do, how our politicians are approached, the demands that are put on them for services is pretty significant. And, you know, in terms of being an economic driver, you absolutely nailed it, Carol. And if we're not going to be adequately financed, there is a serious, significant issue that is at stake here. I find it really striking. We've tried to make this case for quite a while in the Northwest Territories, and our Territorial Association of Communities actually asked the Conference Board of Canada to do a study on the economic impact of municipalities. And that they're finding, basically, if I can try to remember and summarize it, was that the value added by spending at the community level was higher proportionally than it was at spending at the territorial or federal level. There was more of an immediate impact. There was more of an impact on the GDP overall for the territories. So there is proof behind this. It's not just, and certainly, I mean, FCM does this all the time, but when you see these kinds of tangible studies that have found, and based on fact, that will say there is the advantage of investing at the community level that is going to be benefiting everyone across the country.
So why do you think we're in this pickle? I mean, we have a constitution that's 150 plus years old. I get that. But if we all are nodding our heads saying this, yeah, it's clear. What is it about the arrangement that we haven't been able to actually persuade that a change needs to happen? I mean, Carol, do you have a sense of that? You've been at it for a while. What is the impediment?
I think it is a conversation. You know, I'll tell you honestly, I don't come across a lot of people who don't inherently understand the logic, right? That folks sort of understand that, yes, we're dealing, you know, and yes, the Constitution was written so long ago, couldn't conceive of the role of a modern city or community in these days, but here we are with it nonetheless. And I think part of it is what you've described. It's embroiled in conversations that generate quick allergic reactions. You know, it doesn't require an opening of the Constitution, which, for the record, I would argue we haven't even begun to scratch the surface of what's possible within the Constitution right now. But I think there are these red herrings that are, you know, the political third rails, that it's going to take a lot of momentum and public pressure, the creation of space for political leaders to have the courage and be elected on a mandate to say we're going to take this on. And I think that's the reality that we're caught in the crosshairs of. And it's one that I think, you know, we're seeing some areas of improvement. I think we need to learn some lessons and scale them up quickly in terms of how to work together differently. And I think picking, you know, honestly, I think very pragmatically picking an issue that we all agree we need to tackle as a country. I would argue that this imperative is facing us in spades as it relates to homelessness and housing, and saying, you know, this is an issue where the levers that all three orders of government control have a real part to play. And if we're actually going to move a marker, we're going to need to have a coordinated conversation, and we're going to need to apply the resources in the way that they're going to be most impactful.
Could cities drive that, Sadhu? Do you think that municipal governments, you've outlined a whole bunch of challenges. There are health challenges around opioids. There's huge equity challenges. Do you think that cities could be the driver of that conversation and pull the other orders of government into the conversation with you, as opposed to, you know what I mean? Like, can we make this bottom up rather than top down? What do you think?
I definitely think there needs to be a conversation among cities with some ideas of what we think would work. Like Toronto has the ability to have a property transfer tax. So they can layer on a property transfer tax. So when you buy or sell real estate, a certain, 1% or whatever goes to the city, and hundreds of millions of dollars come to them. Is that a solution that could be used across the country? Or are there others, a sales tax? And so I think for us to get clear on what we think are the right set of tools and be on the same page about what those are, I think would help, because we're kind of a little bit all over the place saying, hey, we got some problems here and give us some cash to help here. Or ultimately, we need to get clear that we want some additional tools, and then what those tools are and come up with agreement around what they are. I think fundamentally, the federal government recognizes, at least from what I see, that cities play a critical role, and the success of our economy is really based, and not just the economy, but just the health and vibrancy of our populations are reliant on our cities. So I think we need to get clear as cities around what we think the tools are, and then we need to have a conversation, I think led by FCM, but others as well, around the need to have this conversation, that this isn't about taking money away from another level of government. It's really about enabling and empowering cities to be in the driver's seat. And in Vancouver, I got an example of that is our empty homes tax. We're finding that we had a housing crisis on the one hand, and just a part of that was driven by people buying second or third homes in Vancouver and then not ever living in them, or maybe a month, a year. And so we really wanted to tackle the vacant homes. We recognized we didn't really have the tools on our own to do that. So we worked with the provincial government. They changed our charter, which enabled us to deploy an empty homes tax. So now if you have a second home in Vancouver, you pay 1% of the value, 1.5% of the value of that home toward our vacant home tax. And lots of homes have come back into rental, so they're being more productively used. And we're also, for those that are not being populated again or tenanted, we make some money off of them. And so $20 to $40 million a year comes in, and all of that funding is dedicated 100% on solving the housing crisis. And so that gives us some money to put back into making existing housing more affordable, or to producing more housing. And so I think by working together with the other levels of the government, I think we can come up with some solutions. But so ultimately, I don't think cities can do it on our own. I think we got to get on the same page. We got to work together, and ultimately we need to collaborate with the other levels of government to come up with and actually implement the solutions. And I don't think it's not a zero-sum game. If we get something, it doesn't mean the province gets less. Like, there are very creative solutions here, like the empty homes tax, where that one thing solved multiple problems. It doesn't have to be just one thing or the other, and it doesn't have to be taking away from anyone else.
I doubt they need empty homes taxes up in Yellowknife, but I think this is the point you're making, is that there are different tools and different options and different challenges. And part of what you want is the latitude to be able to figure out what will work for you. Let's spend a couple minutes, if we can, on the economy and how you would start at the very beginning, Sheila. You talked about tourism being decimated. Vancouver has a large tourist population, tourist economy. We're heading into, I bet we're going to have a year of virtually no tourism, I guess, or some local tourism. What are you thinking in terms of how you're going to chart your economic recovery in the absence of being reliant on tourism? Sheila, you first, and then I'll be interested what Sadhu says, and Carol may have a perspective too. Go ahead, Sheila.
Thanks, Mary. Well, it's quite ironic that we had a consultant complete our 10-year economic outlook, our strategy, and they presented to council, I think, the last week of February.
Oh,
and
wow.
then, of course, every assumption that economic development strategy is based on is out the window. And so that's been a huge challenge for us. Again, recognizing that we work with the government of the Northwest Territories that has the mandate for economic development. We're very clear about that. What we try to do is, what are the tools at our disposal that we can utilize to help stimulate the economy? And so any kind of flexibility at all within our planning and zoning, we were 100% behind. What do you need from us? We went out to the chambers of commerce, the various businesses around, to see what is it that you need that we can do. And so what we found, and I'm sure this is the case in other communities as well, there are pockets of the retail and commercial sectors that are doing exceptionally well, and they have benefited. So, but then of course, tourism, hotels, restaurants, tour operators, they are the ones that are decimated right now. And it's a challenge because there's only so much you can do to incite Northerners to go and on a lovely tour. And certainly there have been people that have taken advantage. We have a lot of people that have come to Yellowknife and never left Yellowknife, which is really unfortunate because there's so much to do in the north. Trying to push for that, but recognizing as well that the bailout programs that have come from the territorial and federal governments have been instrumental in keeping these businesses with their heads above water. And I commend them for being as resilient as they can be, with restaurants seeking to pivot to takeout and different kinds of ways of doing things. Our patio programs are still going, which is quite remarkable to me in the climate that we have, and people are trying their best to keep this up. But this is not the answer. And so the tools that we provide to say, we want to be as flexible as we can in terms of zoning, in terms of some of the stimuli that we do, some of our incentivization programs. We've been wide open as a municipality on that, but we're a small player in this. And so what we do is we have worked hard to coordinate with, particularly with the government of the Northwest Territories and the economic arm from the federal government, an agency called CANOR, Canadian Northern Development, to look at, okay, we're contributing money to this. Can you guys get on board as well, so that there's some stacking that's available to some of these businesses in particular that have really been struggling at this time?
I mean, you just talked about trying to emphasize local stuff. I'm wondering if you've talked about procurement, which is totally a no-brainer. I think you're right. Governments should align themselves and do local procurement. What about actually ways to boost the local economy so that one of the things we've noticed at CUI, we did a whole thing called Bring Back Main Street, and we did block studies, and we found that the businesses that were the most resilient were the ones that had very loyal customer bases. If they were dependent on somebody coming from far away, it's much more difficult. But if they had a loyal, have you looked at that at all? And is there a lot of digital economic activity too that's eating into this? And have you found a way to kind of combine that?
Yeah, so we're super aware that Amazon is a big player. We have the reality of so many people shopping online. We have a really robust, really hardworking retail sector in Yellowknife, and they are providing a great array of things for Northerners, when clearly there is an additional cost of being able to do that in the North that may not be as expensive in Edmonton or Vancouver even. So what we look at is, are there ways that we can incentivize people to move away from that model? So for example, we are doing a lot of things around our solid waste management right now. So we are working towards a cardboard ban, which is basically not banning cardboard from the solid waste facility, but making it that there is a very specific avenue for cardboard, because if you're getting your 8 rolls of toilet paper coming in a massive cardboard box to your house thanks to Amazon, that's not a great model. So let's make sure that we build in some of the cause and effect around this. So let's look at the full life cycle of what that decision is, and let's make sure that we can incentivize people away from some of those decisions that may not be good from a waste perspective or from our economic perspective.
Good for you. You're bringing the circular economy to Yellowknife. That's smart. Give it a whirl. Carol, is there any chance that we could ever see some kind of tax imposition on digital purchases that could, and the revenue could accrue to local municipalities? Is that just a crazy idea?
Boy, I think it's one I'd like to think about, as you say out loud right now. I mean, I can tell you that, as we're talking about the economy, and it actually circles into the question you had asked just previously about all of this, which was, one of the first things, we mayors were out there looking into their communities, trying to get PPE and all the immediate sort of safety supports that needed to happen. The next thing mayors did were out there advocating for small businesses in their communities. Right, and supports for small businesses, because they knew that their local economies relied on it, and they needed to keep doing this, even ahead of advocating for operational supports as a municipality that we assumed were going to come at some point.
That's interesting.
And I think that it was a really telling moment about sort of the ways that municipalities and how central they are to all of this. And the point I wanted to make related to our earlier conversation is that we've been talking a lot, I think rightfully so, in terms of the economy around cities, but certainly the pandemic and the impact on rural communities who are relying on the tourism sector, as you're pointing out. Very, very serious. And similarly, the impacts that were felt by the agricultural sector and small communities who were reliant on temporary workers, and a number of real challenges that needed to be overcome right away to keep our food supply as a country going forward. I mean, there were real economic issues that play out in communities of all sizes and cities of all sizes across this country. And I think we're sophisticated enough to understand the diversity of local government in this country and have a sophisticated conversation about what tools need to happen. One of the earlier questions was, what's a barrier? And I think it's a nervousness that a one-size-fits-all approach won't work. we all agree, right? And so in the context of who the audience is for right now is to say that local governments are ready to have this conversation. The same tools aren't required or make sense in all of the same places and communities of different sizes, but let's have that conversation collectively and come out with a better way forward.
So in the remaining time, we don't have that much longer. So I'm going to ask each of you just briefly, just in the remaining time, what's the thing that you're going to focus on for the next 100 days or so? What's the major activity that you want to focus on yourself or in your city, or that you would encourage others to?
Well, you're kind of the 100 days is you're kind of narrowing in on the last couple months that I have in Vancouver. So I got a long list of stuff on my to-do list before I leave.
We have that, right.
I won't go into all of those. You know, I guess what I'd say is, for us in Vancouver, at least, we're in the process of developing our 2021 budget, and kind of based on the conversation we just had, you know, there are so many uncertainties. It's really hard to build a budget. We don't know what kind of federal or provincial support we're going to get. We don't know what the second wave is going to look like and how that's going to impact revenues. We're committed to keeping our services up and running despite the second wave, and finding ways to keep our employees healthy in the midst of that. And so for us, a major challenge and kind of on our work plan for the fall is mapping out the 2021 budget and getting it approved. And given the uncertainties, that's very different than it's ever been for us. And so that's creating new challenges, but also new opportunities, thinking about how we use our office spaces differently, thinking about how we provide our services differently. And so we are trying to take advantage of some of the changes that are happening so that we can be better and more efficient in the way that we do our work. And that's incumbent upon us to figure out, how do we keep that going? How can we really keep the transformation going and build off of that? But really just looking at the budget is going to be one of the big challenges for us in the fall here.
Fiscal responsibility, it's all about that. I appreciate that. Briefly, what about you, Sheila? What's the focus for you?
Sadhu, thank you for that. I think you nailed it. There's so much uncertainty around budget development right now, and so many things that as organizations that are used to planning and the degree that we are, this is a really challenging current status for us to be in. I always like to really take an appreciative inquiry approach whenever possible. And we've run a couple of things for our staff around, tell us the good things that have happened during COVID, to have a couple of in-house contests and different things. And it's always uplifting to see what people have to say around that. And personally for me, and I think as we look at things going forward, when I try to see the positive in COVID, I try to see that this has been like a cosmic wake-up call and a reaffirmation of the values that we hold really close as municipal governments. And so certainly for us, the commitment to safety has been a strong one. You know, the benefit and the art and the importance of really clear and concise communication, whether or not it's internally, whether or not it's been to our residents and our stakeholders, that's so important. Boy, if we didn't have a bunch of counselors that were committed to asset management before, they are now. And that's great. We've used this opportunity and it's been a really worthwhile one for us. And again, all of those different things that we hold as values, whether or not it's resilience, it's compassion, it's you know, trying to be nimble and responsive, trying to be caring to the citizens that come to us for services, vulnerable and otherwise. These are things that we can deliver these at this time, and people are counting on us to do these things. And that's something that I take pride in all of my team doing, and that people have come to rely on at the municipal government, and they know that we will do this for them. Yeah. And I'm really honored that I get to work with people that hold these values as near and close as I do. Right.
Carol, last word to you.
Well, I think, you've just heard two of our members articulate their priorities, which form the basis certainly of ours. And I think at a national level, we're looking at sewing that together and with a real focus on the recovery going forward. If we actually are going to build back better and build a more prosperous, resilient, equitable, and connected country, then that means working with municipalities, local governments are at the heart of that. And we're going to continue to try to bring that focus to conversations with the federal government and across the country, while we keep our members connected with one another as they continue to battle some very real crises on the front lines and keep services going. And so more of the same, but with bigger ambitions, I hope, for how we emerge out of this going forward.
Right. Well, there you have it. 3 municipal leaders talking about what the future of the country is and how dependent it is on the success of its cities and its communities. Thanks for joining us. I'm really pleased, as I said, that IPAC invited us to be with them and to encourage our colleagues in public service across the country to really focus on what local communities need and what we're learning and how we need to listen and watch carefully at what we're learning about how communities actually do rejuvenate and recover themselves, and what kinds of powers and resources they need to do that. So good luck, everybody. Really glad to be with you, and thanks for joining IPAC. And IPAC, thanks for asking us, and good luck with the rest of your conference. Sheila, Carol, Sadhu, nice to see you. Bye.